Okay, a couple things in really quick. First off, I did assign that practice test. And just to be clear, the big thing I learned in the multiple choice done, if you do anything with the essays or short answer questions, write things down, write a thesis, write an outline. I'm getting it. If you do anything like that, I'll take a look at it. So, but I'm not, the big thing I want you to do are the 55 multiple choice. But if you come down with like things for the short answer questions, what you would identify. So please take a look at those. And as I said yesterday, for the short answer question, the practice test I gave you is very good, but it's slightly different. The one I gave you originally, they had you do all 4 short answer questions. Now you just have to do 3, which is, it's kind of a benefit. Let me phrase that. It's a big benefit. So you can throw one out, and that's a good deal. Yeah.
Are there going to be any more review sessions?
Yes, I will do a review session Sunday night.
Sunday night.
Yeah, I got to do about 6:30. I'm sorry, but that's when I got to do it. Yes, I do. Sorry, recycle them. Oh, and so go and take out the Rage Within. Are there any questions from the Rage Within? I hope you liked it. I think they do an excellent job on that series. The last part that I didn't show in class is about Bill Russell. No. Why are we tardy? We got a team effort, okay? And how do you respond to something like that? But the Rage Within it does a very good job, and since we have limited time, I really like to show that, give the personal points of view, the personal attitudes. It does a great job. Are there any questions on anything we could not get? Yes, which one?
Why did they pick the Little Rock?
Which number is that?
Number 8.
So Little Rock Central High was a working class, lower middle class school, and they knew that the white families that were there would be worried about losing status if they allowed black students into their school, and that fit in with that Bacon rebellion thinking that has fueled racism all the way through the Civil War and everything else. You're here. Oh, I threw it away. You are here. You have to leave at 10:45.
Yes.
And I threw it away, so you gotta stay.
No, but I can't.
Nope, I don't make the rules. Did it? Once they enter the trash, you know. So don't worry, I won't be tackled on the way out. Any other questions? Any others? All right, go ahead and turn those in. Beautiful. Beautiful. And don't forget, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education is a big one. It was relatively incomplete. Actually, it had the caveat, you must integrate at the best possible speed, which of course means, yeah. And actually, the United States is more segregated now than it was then. Yes, please bring it down. It is so much easier. Ah. You do it, okay? Did you get it? I know we're trying to transition back to grading this way. It's a lot easier for me. I'll click those tests again so I can recycle them. Anybody did not get the practice test yesterday or Tuesday? So practice test, and I also made this review sheet. I posted it up here, but it is a good thing to go to those topics. You can brainstorm stuff. It's a great. It really does help. You're not going to memorize things, and also help you kind of tie things together. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's make sure that phone goes away. I don't want to see it again. I'll put it away. Okay, so the information for the test, the email they sent out, I know some students didn't get it, so I did post it as a copy of that. I put Far Side cartoons on everything yesterday for reasons I can't explain. And don't forget the sample BBQ stuff. All right, so let us get to the Korean War. So we got 2 shots of 1950. We got McCarthyism, right? We got the Red Scare. And I wasn't clear on that. Make sure you know that's the second Red Scare of McCarthyism. But Korea 1950. And this would be a 3-year hell of fighting. So after World War II, Korea, which was a Japanese colony for years, going back to 1894, they just divided it at the 38th parallel. So it was going to be the same kind of thing as Germany. Oh, I'm not recording. Am I recording? Are we good? Are we recording? Good, okay. But just like what's going to happen in Europe, they ended up in 1949 creating 2 countries. In the north, Kim Il-sung, whose great-grandson is now the dictator of North Korea, he was in charge in the north, and Syngman Rhee, who had spent most of his life outside of Korea, was made the dictator of the south. And he claimed it was a democracy, but it was a dictator and dictatorship. In fact, Korea would have a dictatorship up until the late 1980s. In fact, into the early 1990s, they would finally have a very pluralistic democracy, which it has today. But most of it was a dictatorship. And the thing was, this was a weak government. The U.S. left it with virtually no army, very weak economy. It was basically good luck. Kim Il-sung was the real deal. He was a revolutionary fighter and fought against the Japanese, also fought with Mao, was trained in the Soviet Union. He had an army with plenty of Soviet equipment from World War II, including 100 tanks. South Korea had virtually none. Virtually none. They had a few old things that didn't work. A few Japanese tanks that didn't work. And shocking everybody, on June 25th, 1950, the North attacked. And this northern attack took everybody by surprise, including Stalin. Stalin, who did supply weapons and did want to put pressure on the West, was totally ill-prepared for this. He did not know what was happening. But think about the reaction of the United States. The U.S. did not see it this way and did not know Stalin was so ill-prepared. But we know Stalin did not know. At least Stalin was more thinking that Syngman Rhee might, or Kim Il-sung might press against him a little bit. Truman, though, committed U.S. forces without asking Congress, and remember the National Security Act kind of allows that. And the big reasons, of course, Truman Doctrine thinking says that every communist attack is all being directed by the Soviet Union. Remember what I told you, though. We know now Stalin had no idea. And the domino theory, they said this all the time. Korea was pointed like a knife at China. I say China, I'm sorry, at Japan. And think about what happens next. Korea, Japan, Wyoming. All in a row. But also, don't forget those 2 shocks of 49. China, when the Chinese communists won, this seemed like, oh, they're expanding now to Korea. I mean, this is part of some planned effort by the Soviets. And it's very clear. And one thing's very clear from this looking back. The issues in China have nothing to do with the issues in Korea. But we put it all together. Part of this was Truman kind of stuck himself with this. Once he made this statement, he stuck. And every president from then on is stuck. A little bit like how Truman was stuck with unconditional surrender after Casablanca. Stuck with it. But then McCarthyism. McCarthyism was just a few months before this, and the Red Scare exploded, and they are doing loyalty oaths, and they're blacklisting, and people are being called up in front of Congress. And if you just were called to testify, your career, your life could be ruined. Now, Truman did not want a war. He did not want people to panic and say, this is World War III. And so when he was searching for an answer, a reporter finally said, well, is this a police action? And that's what it's going to be known as, very wry humor of that time. This is just a police action. We're just arresting the North Koreans. This is war. So just 5 years, less than 5 years after the end of World War II, and we're at war again in Asia. in a place that most Americans could not have found on a map, but the communists are winning and we're next. So there was troops in Japan on occupation duty, and so they sent those immediately into Korea. Oh, almost forgot. While this is going on, the United States went to the UN, and they went to the Security Council, and they wanted a UN umbrella, saying this would be a UN effort to stop aggression. Remember that collective security that was such a problem in the League of Nations? But now we'll go to the Security Council. At that time, there were 11 members, but 5 of those members had a what? They had a veto. And of course, the Soviet Union would veto this. But they weren't there. The Soviets had boycotted, there was a Soviet boycott over China. Remember, the People's Republic of China didn't have a seat in the UN. Taiwan had that seat. And since they weren't there, the Security Council voted to make this a, so I didn't type this in, but a UN operation. So technically, all the US troops, South Korean troops, and a few other countries sent a few troops, like Britain sent a brigade, and Australia sent some troops. Turkey sent a brigade. Luxembourg sent like a squad. But they sent little bits of forces under a UN flag. And for some reason, I added 2 S's cadet. I must have Frederick Douglass on my mind. Talk about 2 opposite characters. But General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific, who was actually beyond the retirement age, but he was the Governor General of Japan, occupied Japan. He was given command. And there's MacArthur right here. And he was known as this shockingly arrogant, vainglorious commander who had brief instances of also brilliance, also incompetence, but that happens a lot. He's overall commander. And so they sent the first troops in, and these troops were fat and happy from pretty cushy occupation duty, and you can guess what happened. Right here, just north of Daejeon, which is a big city in South Korea, U.S. forces were routed. Literally, the North Korean tanks just ran right over. I mean, Americans just assumed we'd show up and the North Koreans would run away in fear. No, they routed American troops. And pretty soon, this is a North Korean T-34-85 tank going through Seoul. That's an American wounded soldier in that first operation. I mean, disaster. This set panic was. This was probably a bigger blow to the American psyche than the actual invasion itself. We just assumed we'd show up and win, and now we're going to lose to the communists. That means there must be something about communism that makes them almost like Superman. It must be like some secret juice that it makes them into something that no one can stop. They beat the Nazis, right? And no one thought they could do that. Now, of course, they just had tanks who were better trained and they were ready. Not better trained, but American forces were it was pretty lackadaisical in Japan. The remaining U.S. and South Korean forces had to retreat to what's called the Pusan perimeter. It's still the biggest harbor in South Korea today, right here. But fortunately, the North Koreans outran their supply line. Their tanks began to break down, they ran out of supplies, and they couldn't. They got here by the end of August, and they couldn't push through. And so now American reinforcements are beginning to arrive. So the U.S. called out its reserves. By the way, if you join the armed forces or are drafted by the United States Armed Forces, I know there's no draft now, but I'm just throwing that out there, and you think you're in for a 2 or 4 year hitch. No, they got you for 8. And so men that were drafted in 43, 44, and 45 who fought in World War II, all of a sudden got notices that August saying, you're back in. And boy, were they shocked. That included my wife's grandfather, who was in the Navy at the end of 44 into 45 in the Pacific. He got called back to be on an aircraft carrier. So he had to lead in fact, they just had a son, boom, off into the USS Intrepid. Maybe the greatest hitter in Major League Baseball history, a guy named Ted Williams, played for the Red Sox. And he was a Marine fighter pilot in World War II. In the middle of the season, got called to Korea and then go fight for a year. So if you join the Army now, they got you. Because that happened in 2003, 2004, when Iraq was turning into a disaster after the US invasion. They started calling all these men and women back who thought they were out. I know a few. They were shocked. They got you. So, MacArthur came up with an incredibly daring plan. Daring. Knowing the North Korean supply situation, he's getting reinforcements, including Marines, with all this surplus World War II stuff, and they would attack here at Incheon, which is the harbor city for Seoul. It's not a good place to attack, but he knew. He just had this gut feeling that North Korea would be totally unprepared, and he turned out to be right. So this was an incredibly audacious plan. Here are Marines storming over the seawall right here is a terrible place to invade normally, but the North Koreans were taken by surprise. So that September, U.S. Marines landed here, and they quickly retook Seoul, and North Korea had to do a panicky retreat. They won. It was over. North Korea retreated as fast as they could back into North Korean territory. South Korea was saved. Now, MacArthur made a series of blunders then. Instead of cutting them off here, he decided, let's go take everybody here and invade here. So he made a number of mistakes. But it's over. But MacArthur's mandate was to knock out North Korean aggression. So he decided on his own. He's the commander of UN forces, which is mostly US and South Korean forces. They're drafting every young man in South Korea, 17 and old, you're now in the army. They just would go through at gunpoint and swoop you all in. That's the draft. But, which by the way, you gotta register for next year. I'm smiling under my mask. I need to. I'm too old. You can draft up to your 39. But, so, MacArthur invaded in North Korea. No orders, just crossed the 39th parallel and kept going. The 38th parallel, I'm sorry. I like that one by the engineer setting that up. And quickly, Pyongyang fell, the capital of North Korea, and they advanced to the Yalu River, which is the border with China. In fact, they sent scouts over the Chinese border. Now, a couple things happened. North Korea did not surrender. The U.S. outran its supply lines. And Mao, the new leader of the People's Republic of China, Red China, threatened, if you knock out North Korea, we will have no choice but to defend our southern border. It is intolerable for us to have an ally knocked out. I should add that China and Kim Il-sung didn't like each other, but it's the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. Got it. And one more thing, you can see by the gear right there. So those are American forces well north of Pyongyang. And we found out something that November that Americans did not know, just pure incompetence. It's incredibly cold in Korea. The winters are terrible. We thought since it's about the same latitude as Japan, southern Japan, it should be relatively nice. By November, we're talking 30 below zero. The weather there reminds me a lot of Eastern Montana. Really cold in the winter, really hot in the summer. See, we live in the banana belt here. I don't know if you guys could have made it in Austin. When I was a kid, the average temperature in the winter, and this is not including wind chill, 1,000 below. And in the summer, what was it? 100, 150 every day. Actually, Miles City is the hottest place in the state. I grew up there. That was relatively cool. But that's why I'm so tough. But back to this. Look at the gear they're wearing. That is gear for relatively cool, or just cool weather, not 30 below. They were totally ill supplied. Terrible supplies. But MacArthur just kept pushing them, thinking we're going to end the war by Christmas. They always say that. We'll end the war by Christmas. Truman got a little nervous. He called MacArthur to Wake Island. Wake Island is right about here. Called him to Wake Island. And that's where they met. First time they met. I don't know why I have him and Dean Acheson, but I do. That's Secretary of State. but called them there, and MacArthur assured them, China won't enter, and we'll destroy them if they do. I've been in Asia. That MacArthur had not been back to the U.S. since 1936. I've been here my whole life. I know the way Asians think. He had no idea. In fact, while he was saying that, U.S. forces were already meeting Chinese forces infiltrating over the Yalu. And in November, just before Thanksgiving, 1950, Chinese forces totally and completely surprised U.S. and South Korean forces. All on the border, a massive attack. Waves of Chinese forces. Now, they didn't have very big, they had almost no tanks, almost no heavy equipment, but there were a lot of Chinese. And they're better equipped with these padded winter jackets. They had much better gear. And by the way, they mostly attacked at night because of American air power. And so veterans of Korea would tell me stories about, they, to this day, they heard of bugles. They would start with just, because that's how the Japanese or the Chinese would start their attacks by morning bugles. So bugles made them afraid. I can see that. So this is the Time magazine body blow. You know what that quick brass knuckle there just makes me laugh. But the army was totally surprised right here in the mountains of northern North Korea. Just go with me on that. And it would turn out to be the worst battlefield defeat for American forces since the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. An absolute disaster. A panicky retreat all the way back to Seoul. Marines were almost cut off here completely, and they had to fight their way to a few harbor cities to be pulled out by the Navy. I mean, this was an absolutely humiliating defeat. They swept all the way south of Seoul. Humiliating defeat, and MacArthur, who said it would never happen, looked like an idiot. Deservedly so. He never left Tokyo. He had no idea what was going on. Didn't read his intelligence reports. He thought he had solved the war. And his response, as a lot of people do who are panicking, his response to widen the war. He wanted to use atomic bombs to hit Beijing and lay atomic waste all along this border here. So China couldn't, so radiation, a wall of radiation. So China couldn't aid their forces in North Korea. And if the Soviets do anything, we should bomb the Soviet Union with atomic bombs. So he wanted World War III to hide his incompetence. And these are the Marines retreating after that big offensive in November, a place called the Chosin Reservoir. Truman ordered him to shut up. Shut up. What did MacArthur do? Publicly said Truman's an imbecile and helping the communists. Finally, Truman, this was a tough one. They finally fired MacArthur. In fact, he promoted a general who was a 4-star general to a 5-star general to get fired. It's very complex. And this would lead to waves of support for MacArthur. You'll bring MacArthur back, and Truman's helping the Red Chinese. He had a ticker tape parade, one of the biggest in history, through on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And this was such a big deal. And Truman took a lot of heat, and a lot of people believed this might send MacArthur to the presidency. He would be the hero of the rapidly growing, rabid, anti-communist right wing. And this included both Republicans and Democrats. It was probably a majority of Republicans and a significant number of Democrats. And Truman would be blamed. That's him on the hot seat right here. Get it? With the firing of MacArthur. Here's this little pipsqueak Truman fired the great hero. In fact, Truman, part of the reason he would be so unpopular when he left office was because of this. Truman's popularity, they just started taking approval polls of presidents, and it seemed like he would be one of the most unpopular in history. Looking back, Truman is actually a pretty popular president looking back, but at that time, no. So, as it turned out, MacArthur's bombastic talk of World War III only appealed to a relatively small group, some Democrats, more Republicans, but not near the majority. But back in Korea, stalemate would happen. Truman would pick a much better general to command, Matt Ridgway. Now the Chinese supply line was too long, and so UN forces, mostly UN, pushed them back to this line right here, and basically then after it became trench warfare. Here are US forces entrenched, fighting for the high ground. Here's a Chinese soldier with a Soviet submachine gun, and stalemate. And it would be that way for 2 years. A horrible trench warfare, nightmarish trench warfare. So very much like World War I. It devolved into that. While that's going on, we're going to have an election. And you can argue that when stalemate devolved and the political outcome of that, you have the real beginning of what we look at as the 50s. And this cultural, economic, and political changes here that would affect us to this very day. And it's more than just McDonald's. When, yes, the first McDonald's would come out, anybody know what city the first McDonald's was in? It's obviously San Bernardino, California. Who had that on their pool? The first McDonald's is gone. They bulldozed it in the 60s, which makes me sad. Who likes McDonald's? When I was a little kid, McDonald's was such a treat that I still kind of like it. I know there's some issues with it. There's a few like it, right? All right, I like the old McDonald's. I like the old shops. So, the election in 1952, Korea and communism would be on everybody's mind. Okay, square. MacArthur was not who, especially liberal Republicans, wanted. When Dwight Eisenhower said, you know, I might want to run for president, and I'm a Republican, it was immediate he got the Republican nomination. Conservative Republicans were furious with Eisenhower. And that is why they would choose a young up-and-coming politician from California, just elected senator by the name of Richard Nixon. And he was the master of, remember I gave you this term before, red baiting, accusing your opponent of communism. He was a master of it. Now, he was not as anti-New Deal as most conservative Republicans were, but he was, and some conservative Democrats, but he was the red baiter. Now, the Democrats pulled back from civil rights. They nominated the very eloquent, but reluctant, governor of Illinois, who thought was good, everyone thought an up-and-coming politician, Adlai Stevenson. And I couldn't resist putting the pack of cigarettes that Democrats would give out to promote Adlai Stevenson. So here's the smoke, vote for Stevenson. Now remember, this was at the era when everybody smoked. And like, for example, pregnant women were told, smoke, it'll help you relax and ease morning sickness. You have asthma? Smoke. Slightly different era. Not completely. We're going to become the vaping state, so I guess it's all about the same. And Stevenson totally avoided civil rights, eloquent speaker, but not a great candidate, and he didn't want to run. Because Eisenhower was so popular, he knew he'd be a sacrificial lamb. And he was kind of right. And the Republicans had the great advantage that they were running against a party that had been in the White House since 1932. So they could just bring up everything they could. And what did they do? This was their soft on communism. Look how they blundered in Korea. Truman is an imbecile. But not just that. They brought up the idea of the bomber gap. By the way, nickname Ike, Eisenhower Ike. I know it doesn't quite work, but yeah. Oh, the Eisenhower pin? Yeah. I got a Nixon pin somewhere. Oh, and then, gotta tell you, this is my favorite. As much as I like the Eisenhower, the LBJ one that kind of does this. LBJ for the USA. Pretty cool, huh? Should I put them both on? Yeah. Yeah, I love the online, but, and this came from the Truman, or the Eisenhower Library in Kansas.
Yeah, you gave it.
I remember that.
I say vote for
Yeah,
Baker.
Cameron gave it out, and we got, how long?
Uh,
Was it 2 years ago?
okay, like 2
Years, everything passes.
Yeah.
Young Nixon looks really weird.
Well, then whenever they, the old time cut and paste where they literally cut them out and put it in there, that was a little weird. So the thought was because of the Democrats either being incompetent or pinkos, sympathetic to communism, they allowed the Soviets to get more long-range bombers. And that's the bomber gap. Because of Joe 1 and the start of Soviet, the idea of this massive Soviet military, people believed, and the Republicans pushed this, that the Soviets had bombers that could fly over the Arctic, lay waste to American cities, fly back, and do it again. These are called strategic bombers. And the Soviets had hundreds of thousands of these. And so there are visions of bombers coming over in waves, laying waste to American cities. Was there a bomber gap? Well, yes. The United States had almost 2,000 B-29, B-50, and this new jet bomber called the B-47. They're medium range, but we had bases in Japan, Korea, Turkey, Italy, Norway, Germany. They could reach most of the Soviet Union. And the Americans had made long-range strategic bombers, including this plane is one of the most amazing things ever built, designed at the end of World War II, called the B-36. It had 6 pusher engines and 4 jet engines. It had a range of 12,000 miles. It was so big that they would actually work out plans to rig a little fighter plane underneath it so it could defend itself over Soviet territory. That is a B-29 bomber, the massive bomber that did the bombing of Japan, including the atomic bomb. It's dwarfed. It is absolutely dwarfed. This plane is so big, it had 2 crews. It carried 2 crews. It had a galley and sleeping quarters for the second crew while the first one flew. So we could bomb from bases in the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It's the biggest, at least by wingspan, production plane ever made. I've seen one of these in a big air museum, and you just can't believe how big it is. And the U.S. will soon build a plane that we still use, called the B-52. It shows you how also what a waste of money the other planes being built afterwards were, the B-1 and B-2, but that's another story for down the road. But that plane, how many long-range bombers did the Soviets? Oh, we had 500 of them. None. Not a one. But people believed it. People believed it. And Truman knew it was a bunch of garbage, and so did Eisenhower. But they couldn't say anything because of national security. This worked so well, it's hard to put into terms. I should also add that, do you think Democrats would do the same thing down the road for maybe missiles? Maybe a certain guy by the name of Kennedy? Yes. Exactly. It goes hand in hand. This is also the first campaign where TVs were coming into widespread use. More and more families were getting TV. By 1952, there were nationwide broadcasts. And there's the first advertising of products. A guy named Rosser Reeves would be hired to do the Eisenhower campaign. Stevenson's commercials, they tried to do, they're horrible. Eisenhower, quick little pithy campaigns of him saying something. Or, of course, the most famous one. Are you ready? The great campaign ad of all time.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going. Travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way. We'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, Washington. We'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
One more time! By the way, Ike doesn't have a full...
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike.
Oh, I'll bring it. So, Eisenhower would win a massive victory. Since Stevenson avoided the issue of civil rights, the Solid South returned back to the Democrats, but that will end in the 1960s. And this was only for president, though. It would be, even in the Senate, the Democrats held a massive majority in the House, but a liberal Republican, Eisenhower, was president. And he would be elected for 2 terms. 56 would be a repeat of 54, almost exactly the same results. Almost exactly. A very popular president, even though members of his own party were soon calling him a communist. And that should get back to one thing. If people say that politics are bitter today, and it's never been like this before. Well, they're either saying that because they want you to think something today, or they're incompetent. Either way, don't trust them, because it's never been like this before. I'm kidding. The thing is, don't trust people who say that. We've had lots of time like this. This happened over and over again. And it seemed to kind of work. A few months into the presidency, they signed an armistice in Korea on that very same line I showed you before, which is still the border today. They signed an armistice, which is a ceasefire. There has never been a peace treaty. So technically, North Korea and South Korea are still at war, so technically the United States is still at war. The U.S. still has over 28,000 troops and an air wing there. So the U.S. is still there. And the reason the North Korean government survives this awful, terrible totalitarian state is because they have their mortal enemy they must all rally to stop, the U.S. and South Korea. It's unfortunate they can't come up with a peace agreement, but that would probably end the North Korean government, and they know it. North Korea can survive this horrible state as long as they have an enemy. Almost 40,000 American soldiers died. Over 2.5 million Koreans died. Over 700,000 Chinese died. This war was a bloodbath. And what came out of it? Nothing. I guess the U.S. and its side didn't lose, but by advancing across the 38th parallel, they almost lost. Terrible fight. UN forces, these are the British, Turkish, and a few other countries that sent. Canada sent a battalion, things like that. So Eisenhower called his program, his domestic program, dynamic conservatism. You need a name, like the Fair Deal, New Deal, you need a name. And dynamic conservatism, he wanted to play on this growing conservative idea. It was more of a nostalgic idea. There's a real idea in the early 50s to go back to the 20s. You know, the roaring 20s before the Depression and war. So like in the 1970s, it was to go back to the 50s. We still have people who want to go back to the 50s. And basically, as a liberal New Deal, or a liberal Republican, he's going to keep the New Deal. A big government program would be passed here. It's called the Federal Aid Highway Act. Sometimes you see it called the National Defense Highway Act. But as you can see from that sign from the 1960s, it is called the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. So they built the interstate highway. I was in the 1980s when they finished most of the routes across Montana. And there's those parts they were just finishing into the 1990s. But that's the interstate highway system. I should add, it is designed to only last for a couple years. Then you have to redo it. So you constantly have to keep pumping money into the economy. So that was a way of massive government aid for local governments. You just keep pumping money in. So when you complain about them, you know, all the highway construction, for reasons of the way our economy works, that was planned. Also, they expanded Social Security to farm workers and household help. These were excluded because of Southern Democrats wouldn't support it because a lot of these workers were black. That's part of the reason why healthcare is the way it is. Since national healthcare insurance didn't happen, employers got a tax deduction to include as part of pay health insurance. And so that is why just under half of all Americans get their health insurance from their employer, like me. That's my pay. We have a very Rube Goldberg system, and that's doing injustice to Rube Goldberg. But the economy was changing dramatically. This consumer economy that was growing in the 1920s, based upon people buying stuff, people going out and buying material, was changing fast. And by the 1950s, it's going to be between 60 and 70% of the economy was based upon consumers buying stuff. The problem is by the early 1950s, when factories began to retool for consumer goods, they were producing more than what people were demanding. And for them to survive, they need to sell all the time. Remember the first cause of the Great Depression, overproduction. How do you convince people to buy stuff, especially when they buy a car and they don't need a car next year? And this is why this would be the second golden age of advertising. Why do you think there's a new model year? So they get advertised that the old year, new model year for cars or whatever it might be. You have a 2020, you're a loser. You need a 2021. Who agrees with me? Yeah. If you have these iPhone 7 or whatever they are, people are going to laugh at you. You need an iPhone expensive or whatever they're called now. But the iPhone, take out a second mortgage. And they convince people to buy that. Advertising is the fine art of convincing people to buy things they don't need. And it's no coincidence either that you have all these people who sold propaganda in World War II are selling televisions in World War II. No, in the 1950s. It's amazing that we avoided World War III. After the AP exam, I might tell you a couple of the stories of how close we came. The one in 79, oh, I'm so glad I didn't know. Look at that thing, 13 inches. But the biggie is planned obsolescence. And planned obsolescence is literally what it sounds like. You plan to make products that will break right away. We'll finish this on Friday. Think about how many things in our society are disposable. That's on purpose. So you have to buy new ones. Few things are worse than bottled water. Don't get me wrong, I occasionally have bottled water too, but boy, what a waste. Don't forget now, you don't, anything after you do on the essays, if you want me to take a look at it, I will look at it, but I want the multiple choice. Who's done the multiple choice on it yet? So what are you doing tonight? It's just 55 multiple choice. You should have no more than 2 or 3 minutes. If you're done in about 40 minutes, that means you got lots of time to think and plan. You're going to be in great shape. But don't think yourself. Don't outthink yourself and change one unless you know for sure. See you tomorrow? Yeah. What's that? Oh. Don't worry, we'll come back to it. Tell me tomorrow. Oh. I got something. Try to decide if I should bring out the frisbee. Heck yeah. You gotta put razor blades on. Wow, that got harsh. And it's on film. I forgot to shut this off.
That's not good. Just kidding.
Bro.
I'm all fraud, I know.
Bro, you lied.
But sometimes you gotta get Monday night.